من از اونجایی که فارسیم، حالا شاید باور نکنید ولی من با سیکل ایران اینجا هستم، وقتی صحبت‌های خیلی کامپلیکیتد میشه من سویچ میکنم انگلیسی. در نتیجه تصمیم گرفتم این پرزنتیشن به انگلیسی انجام بدم. اگر سوالی بود در مورد ترجمه، مطمئنا کسای دیگه هستن که ترجمه کنن. So what I thought about was to start with Will's psychological profile. So if you go into, if you Google reviews of this book, you'll see the. Yeah. Oh, sure. من مریم ابراهیمپور هستم، سایکوتراپیست هستم توی تورنتو و توی فیلد منتال هلث، یوث منتال هلث سنتر کار میکنم با بچه‌هایی که منتال هلث ایشو دارن، ادیکشن دارن و یوث جاستیس. برای همین از من خواسته شد از طرف ناصر که بیام صحبت کنم در مورد این کانسپت که توی این فیلم هستش. I'm going to start talking about the psychological profile of Will and then start talking about the relationship with the therapeutic relationship between Sean and Will, and a little bit context of what's going on. Obviously there are so many cliches and Hollywood style of how they're taking a look at a relationship between a therapist and a client. When you look at Will's profile online or even in the movie, he talks about attachment disorders. There's speculations of whether he has post-traumatic stress disorder and potentially anxiety. If you're not familiar with attachment disorders, they can be caused by neglect or abuse from early age, and they result in various forms of symptoms. For example, there could be aggression, difficulties in relationships, difficulties with forming trusting and loving relationships with same-age partners and also adults, and also youth justice involvement. So when we look at Will, we clearly see that he has. He's having difficulty forming relationships with loving relationships. He clearly has a long history of abuse that he mentions. There's quite a bit of evidence in where that comes from. There's research on adverse childhood effects that shows that there's a direct link between childhood trauma with aggression, with depression, anxiety, alcoholism, and justice involvement. So where is that coming from, and what has happened? What happens to people when they get hurt by the people that love them the most? That's basically grounded in the science of attachment. I'm just going to show you guys a very short clip just to demonstrate that. This is a 2-minute experiment that was done. This is a clip of a 2-minute experiment that's done, and it talks about a very small impact of what could happen when adults don't respond properly to children.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 34 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In this still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a good girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay. Okay, Melissa. Okay. So you can see in those 2 minutes the impact of what happens to a child. So now imagine Will has gone through 20 years of abuse. He's gotten stabbed, he's gotten burned. Clearly no responsible adults that were responsive to him throughout his life, so he had to develop his own coping skills. Studies show that we develop positive and negative coping skills, and in reality, whatever coping skills that we pick when we're growing up with anything as little as this or as extensive as being abused, they're very responsive in that moment, and they're keeping the child and the person alive and helping them cope with whatever's happening in that moment. When it becomes negative or to their disadvantage is how it cannot change and form into other circumstances. So clearly in Will's situation, what was happening is that he needed to be aggressive in order to survive in a very aggressive foster home. What it wasn't working is when you go out in the community and you kick a cop in the shin, you get arrested. So you can just see and experience that if this was happening for 2 minutes to a child and it was so dysregulating, what the impact is on Will. So when we look at Will, clearly aside from his negative coping skills, which is the aggression, the ability to avoid relationships and vulnerabilities, he has a lot of positive coping skills. And those positive coping skills are resiliency. So resiliency, the definition of resiliency is being able to bounce back from adverse effects. And we all have resilient factors, that's how we survive, and so does Will. Part of the resiliency is being able to be acknowledged for being good in school, or being able to be acknowledged for it and being noticed. Clearly he has a high IQ that has kept him doing fairly okay. I mean, he has a long rap sheet to follow him around. But that's not enough. It's not just enough to have high IQ and to do good in school or to do good at work. In order to survive, we're social beings, we have to have relationships, and we have to be able to rely and be vulnerable to other people, and that's what's missing for him. So that's what he's getting out of the relationship he's developed with Sean, who William plays. Before I get into their relationship, I want to talk about the history of it, because I'm not really sure if they even knew what they were doing in this movie, in terms of they've developed this emotional relationship and this story, and whether this was intentional, I don't know. I'll leave it to the experts to talk about that. But in terms of historically, client, and when we're looking at where they're at 20 years ago, I don't think they had the foresight to know what's coming ahead in the science of therapy, but historically, at the very beginning, and there's mentions to hypnosis. He does a session of hypnotism with another clinician, and there's talks about, you see the couch, it's very much like a cliche. You see a couch in every clinician's office where people can lie down. That's actually not the case. It was in 1700s, which is when hypnotism came along. And so back when hypnotism came along, the very beginning stages of the concept of therapy, the notion was the patient or the person is not in charge of what's happening in their bodies, and that there's a magnetic force that needs to be directed through someone's facilitation. So Mesmer, who the term mesmerizing comes from, in fact, is the founder of this school of thought, where he thought that we have that he, in fact, has magnetic powers, and so he would feed his patients some sort of a liquid with iron in it, and he would move his hands and hope that through movement, this ailment, psychological or physical, would move out of the person. And so at the beginning stages of therapy, and essentially where hypnotism comes from, nobody's in charge of the process of healing, and it just happens by unraveling things that have been dug into the subconscious. When we go forward, and I mean, they talk about Freud in here as well. Freud, we're talking late 1800s, so it's 1890s. Again, his mentality, or he's the very first people who thought of the concept of doing therapy. He's also not talking in the sense of developing a relationship with his patients. He's thinking that, again, we're not in control of who we are and our nature, and whether they've experienced sexual abuse or any sort of abuse. Especially, he became fascinated with sexual stages of development in people. Again, we're sort of at mercy of our nature, and we're sort of have to just live with it and just recognize that they're there. We've come a long way. That was I'm losing count of it, 130 so years ago. But we owe a lot to Freud in the sense of he started the concept of therapy, and he started some of the ideas around being able to develop some sort of a stage of development for human beings. But a lot of his theories have been debunked, and we're just understanding human body in a different way. His theories could not be proven right or wrong because they were not grounded in any sort of science. But as we've moved into the concept of psychology as a science, looking at neuroscience and brain sciences, we can actually see the impact of therapy and what's happening. So we move forward to like mid 1900s, 1950s. We have Carl Rogers, who's taking a look at a relationship that's very one way again. So there's a therapist and a patient. The patient's it's very client-centered, so the patient's now in charge, but again, the relationship is one way, there is no reciprocation. But when we move to 21st century, which is nowadays, there is a concept called safe and effective use of self. It's a brand new subject. I don't think Ben Affleck knew about it back in the 1990s. I don't think that's what he intended to do, but essentially there is belief and science in the fact that any treatment has to be trauma-informed. That means that we have to understand that almost all of us have experienced trauma, and so in order to be able to heal, we have to address those traumas. But in order to address those traumas, you have to create safe spaces where people can come and develop safe, secure relationships with that therapist. And in order to do that, the therapist has to be willing to bring themselves into the room. They can't be a blank slate and walk in and do what you see on TV, which is a therapist just saying, how does that make you feel? How does that make you feel? And the person's lying on a couch and just having what Freud would have, those free associations, and just talk forever and ever. In fact, a therapist has to be very self-aware, have to do a lot of personal work in order to be able to be present in the room. And the direction that you're using is a trauma-informed direction. So that's essentially what Sean is doing in the movie. I don't know if he knows that what he's doing, but he's bringing his story into the room. And through bringing his story into the room and talking about his process of experiencing safe relationship with a loving adult that was very much bidirectional, and being able to talk about his experiences of trauma and loss, he was able to let this child, essentially, a 20-year-old is still a child. There's science that now shows our brain doesn't stop growing till we're 25. So we're talking about a 21-year-old that, just for you guys to know, Government of Ontario has now recognized that youth go up to the age of 29. So we're talking about a child. So here's an adult man who's trying to role model what a healthy attachment looks like to him. And that's what he's doing. It's not an easy job. I know this is a movie. He's doing it, I don't know, like twice a week for, I don't know, a few months. But this is essentially what the process looks like. Am I doing our time? I'm good? I'm good? So just to wrap things up, the reason that we're talking about this is there's in fact science that shows, and we can talk about it further, but there's now neuroscience that looks at the brain and how we're able to manage pain when we go through the process of therapy. So Dr. Sue Johnson, who actually works out of Ottawa, she's a psychologist, she has now started to look at couples and their pain tolerance, and she puts the couples into an fMRI before a therapeutic session starts, and while they're in an fMRI, she shocks them with electricity and records the brain waves that impact that show pain, and then puts them through process of therapy, sees them through however many number of sessions, and again does the same thing, gives them a shock, records their brain waves, and in fact, adults who go through couples therapy are able to show in their brain activity and also in their self-report that they don't experience as much pain when they're with their partners. So there's quite a bit of science that has come along in all these years. I'm happy to talk about other things, but I think in terms of time, I just wanted to wrap this up. There's clearly there was an attempt from Ben Affleck to explore this relationship, and I think in the fact that he probably didn't know so much about the science and was working from the human relationship, I think he captured quite a good, realistic understanding of what it takes to go through that process.